Frank Morrison thought he was getting the deal of his lifetime when he walked into Peterson Motors that Tuesday morning. The 73-year-old Vietnam veteran had been riding motorcycles for 50 years, and he knew quality when he saw it. What he didn't know was that the gleaming Harley-Davidson Electra Glide in the showroom was about to cost him everything he'd saved for retirement. Within 6 weeks, 250 leather-clad bikers would descend on this very dealership, and the smooth-talking owner would discover that some debts can't be paid with lies and excuses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Morrison adjusted his worn leather vest as he stepped out of his pickup truck in the parking lot of Peterson Motors. The September sun beat down on the asphalt in Riverside, California, but Frank barely noticed the heat. His attention was fixed entirely on the pristine motorcycle, visible through the dealership's floor-to-ceiling windows. After 37 years working construction and 12 years driving long-haul trucks after that, Frank had finally decided to treat himself. His wife Martha had passed away 2 years earlier, and the house felt too quiet without her humming in the kitchen or calling out reminders about doctor appointments. The only thing that still brought him real joy was the open road and the rumble of a motorcycle engine beneath him. His current ride, a 1998 Road King, had served him well through countless weekend trips to Sturgis and daily rides through the desert highways around his home in Barstow. But lately, the old bike had been showing its age. The transmission slipped on steep grades, and last month he'd spent $800 just to keep it running. Frank's mechanic, Tommy Rodriguez, had been honest with him. "Frank, you're throwing good money after bad," Tommy had said, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. "That bike's got maybe 6 months left in her, and that's being generous. Start looking for something newer." So here Frank stood, studying the 2019 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide Ultra Limited that dominated Peterson Motors' showroom floor. The bike was magnificent, midnight black with chrome accents that caught the afternoon light like mirrors. The odometer showed only 3,200 miles, and every surface gleamed as if it had just rolled off the factory floor. The glass doors opened with a chime, and Frank was immediately greeted by a man in his early 40s, wearing a pressed white shirt and navy slacks. His smile was broad and his handshake firm. "Welcome to Peterson Motors. I'm Rick Peterson, owner of this little slice of heaven. What brings you in today?" Frank gestured toward the Electra Glide. "That beauty right there. Been riding for 50 years, and I've never seen one kept in such pristine condition." Rick's eyes lit up. "Ah, you've got excellent taste. That particular bike has quite a story. Owned by a retired airline pilot from Phoenix who garage-kept it and only rode it to church on Sundays. Poor guy developed arthritis and couldn't handle the weight anymore. Broke his heart to sell it, but his loss is someone else's gain." Frank walked slowly around the motorcycle, noting the unblemished chrome exhaust pipes and the supple leather of the saddlebags. He'd owned enough bikes to spot the telltale signs of heavy use: worn foot pegs, scratched engine cases, cables frayed from weather exposure. This bike showed none of those signs. "What's the damage?" Frank asked, though he was already mentally calculating how much of his retirement savings he was willing to spend. Rick pulled out a tablet and scrolled through some screens. "Well, considering the condition and the low mileage, I've got it listed at $32,000. But I'll tell you what, I can see you're a serious rider, not some weekend warrior looking for a toy. For you, I could come down to $29,500. Frank tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside he was doing cartwheels. Similar bikes with comparable mileage were listed online for $35,000 to $38,000. Even at $29,500, this represented a significant savings. Can I take it for a test ride?" "Absolutely. Let me grab the keys and we'll get you some paperwork to sign." 20 minutes later, Frank was cruising down Highway 215, the Electra Glide purring beneath him like a contented cat. The bike handled flawlessly. Smooth acceleration, responsive braking, and a suspension system that absorbed road imperfections with ease. The sound system was crystal clear, and the GPS navigation screen was larger and more intuitive than anything on his old bike. When he returned to the dealership, Frank's mind was made up. He'd been saving money for almost 4 years, specifically for this purpose, and his bank account could cover the purchase price with enough left over for insurance and registration. "I'll take it," he announced as he handed the keys back to Rick. Rick's smile grew even wider. "Outstanding choice! Now let's talk about financing options. I've got some fantastic rates available, and you could walk out of here today with payments as low as $400 a month." Frank shook his head. "No need for financing. I'll pay cash." Something flickered across Rick's expression, surprise, maybe even disappointment. But it was gone so quickly, Frank wondered if he'd imagined it. "Cash it is. Even better. Let me get the paperwork started." For the next hour, Frank signed document after document. Rick explained each form briefly. Sales contract, title transfer, registration paperwork, warranty information. Frank read through most of it, though the legal language was dense and the font size seemed designed for people with much better eyesight than a 73-year-old construction worker possessed. "Now, Frank, I need to be upfront about one thing," Rick said as they neared the end of the paperwork. "The title is currently held by the bank that financed the previous owner's purchase. It's a very common situation. The paperwork to transfer a clean title takes about 6 to 8 weeks to process. But don't worry, I'll give you a bill of sale and temporary registration that will let you ride legally while we wait for the official title to come through." Frank frowned. 6 to 8 weeks seems like a long time. I know it sounds excessive, but you know how slow government bureaucracy moves. Plus, with the previous owner being from Arizona, it involves coordinating between 2 state DMV systems. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I promise you this is standard procedure. In the meantime, you've got full legal documentation showing you own the bike. Rick handed Frank a manila envelope, thick with papers. "Everything you need is right here. Bill of sale, temporary registration, warranty paperwork, owner's manual, even the spare keys." Frank opened his checkbook and wrote out a check for the full amount, $20,500. Rick examined it briefly, then slid it into his desk drawer. "Pleasure doing business with you. Frank, I know you're going to love that bike." As Frank rode his new motorcycle home to Barstow that evening, the desert air rushing past his face, he felt more alive than he had in months. The bike performed flawlessly on the winding mountain roads, and he was already planning weekend trips to Sedona and the Grand Canyon. What Frank didn't know was that in Rick Peterson's desk drawer, alongside his check, were 17 other checks from 17 other buyers, each one believing they had purchased the same motorcycle with the same story about the retired airline pilot. What Frank also didn't know was that the 2019 Electra Glide Ultra Limited he was riding had been reported stolen from a dealership in Las Vegas 3 months earlier, and what Frank couldn't have possibly known was that among his fellow victims was a man named Samuel Diesel McKenna, a 68-year-old former Marine who happened to be the president of the Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels. 3 weeks after purchasing his dream motorcycle, Frank Morrison sat in the waiting room of the California DMV office in Barstow, clutching the manila envelope Rick Peterson had given him. The temporary registration was set to expire in 10 days, and despite calling Peterson Motors twice, he still hadn't received his permanent title. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass was a middle-aged woman named Dorothy, whose nameplate indicated she'd been working there for 23 years. She examined Frank's paperwork with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every possible permutation of automotive documentation fraud. "Sir, I'm going to need you to have a seat while I make some phone calls," Dorothy said. Her tone suddenly formal. Frank's stomach tightened. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine verification. It'll take about 15 minutes, but 15 minutes stretched into 45. And when Dorothy finally called Frank back to the window, her expression was grim. "Mr. Morrison, I need to inform you that the vehicle identification number on your motorcycle matches a bike reported stolen from Henderson, Nevada Harley-Davidson 3 months ago. I'm required by law to contact local law enforcement. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. That's impossible. I bought this bike from a licensed dealer. I have the bill of sale right here. Dorothy's voice softened slightly. Sir, I believe you're telling the truth about purchasing the motorcycle in good faith. But the VIN doesn't lie. This bike was stolen from a dealership lot in Las Vegas on June 15th. 20 minutes later, Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos arrived at the DMV office. She was a compact woman in her 30s, with intelligent brown eyes and an air of calm authority. Frank explained the entire transaction while she took notes in a small pad. Mr. Morrison, you're not in any legal trouble, Deputy Santos assured him. You're what we call an innocent purchaser. However, I do need to impound the motorcycle as evidence while we investigate this dealership. Frank watched helplessly as his dream bike was loaded onto a tow truck. The deputy handed him a receipt and a business card. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm going to be honest with you, she said. Recovery of your money is going to depend entirely on whether Rick Peterson has any legitimate assets. Most of these operations are designed to strip cash quickly and disappear. That evening, Frank sat in his empty garage, staring at the oil stain where his old Road King used to sit. He'd sold that bike to help cover insurance costs for the new one. Now he had neither a motorcycle nor $29,500 from his retirement savings. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Morrison? This is Detective James Brennan with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I understand you recently had some trouble with Peterson Motors. You could say that. I'm calling because you're not the first person to contact us about Rick Peterson. In fact, you're number 18. Would you be willing to come in tomorrow to give a formal statement? The next morning, Frank drove his pickup truck to the sheriff's station in downtown Riverside. Detective Brennan was a tall man with graying hair and the weary demeanor of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with human greed. Mr. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until we make arrests, Brennan began, spreading a collection of photographs across his desk. Rick Peterson has been running this scam for at least 8 months. He purchases salvage motorcycles at auction, cleans them up cosmetically, then sells them multiple times using fabricated paperwork. Frank studied the photos. Each one showed the same Electra Glide he'd purchased, but photographed with different people shaking hands with Rick Peterson. Same bike, different buyers, Brennan continued. Peterson would arrange test rides on different days, making sure buyers never overlapped. Each person thought they were getting an exclusive deal on a one-owner bike. How many people did he scam? That we know of? 43 victims. Total loss of approximately $1.2 million. But here's where it gets interesting. Brennan pulled out another folder. One of those victims is a gentleman named Samuel McKenna. Ring any bells? Frank shook his head. Samuel McKenna, age 68, retired Marine Corps sergeant, paid $31,000 for the same bike you bought. He also happens to be the president of the Riverside Hells Angels chapter. A chill ran down Frank's spine. Everyone who'd ridden motorcycles in Southern California for any length of time knew about the Angels. They weren't the cartoon villains portrayed in movies, but they also weren't people you wanted to cross. McKenna came in here 2 days ago, Brennan continued. Seems he's been conducting his own investigation into Peterson Motors. He's identified at least 20 of the other victims, and he's not particularly happy about the situation. What kind of investigation? Brennan leaned back in his chair. The legal kind, mostly. McKenna's got connections throughout the motorcycle community. Word travels fast when someone's ripping off bikers. He's been tracking down other victims, documenting their losses, even hiring a private investigator to locate Peterson's assets. Frank was impressed despite himself. It sounds like he's doing your job for you. In some ways, yes. McKenna understands that if he or his club members do anything illegal, it'll hurt the case against Peterson. He's been very careful to stay within the law, but he's also made it clear that he expects justice to be served. Detective Brennan handed Frank a business card with Samuel McKenna's contact information. He's organizing a meeting of all the victims tomorrow night at the American Legion Hall in Riverside. McKenna thinks there's strength in numbers, and frankly, I agree with him. The next evening, Frank walked into the American Legion Hall to find it packed with about 30 people, most of them middle-aged or older men wearing motorcycle leathers. At the front of the room stood Samuel McKenna, and Frank understood immediately why this man had risen to leadership in the Hells Angels. McKenna was built like a fire hydrant, short, broad, and radiating an aura of contained power. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Gentlemen, and the few ladies present, we're here because Rick Peterson thought he could steal from the motorcycle community and walk away clean. He was wrong." McKenna gestured to a large whiteboard covered with photographs, names, and dollar amounts. "My associate here, Jack Turner, is a retired police detective turned private investigator. Jack, tell them what you found." Jack Turner was a thin man in his 60s wearing a rumpled suit. He stood and addressed the room with the practiced delivery of someone who'd testified in hundreds of court cases. "Peterson's operation is more sophisticated than initially believed. He's been using multiple business names, cycling through them every few months to stay ahead of complaints. Peterson Motors, Desert Wind Motorcycles, Golden State Bike Sales. All the same guy, same location, different paperwork." Turner clicked a remote, and a projector displayed financial records on the wall behind him. "We've traced approximately $2 million in fraudulent sales over the past 14 months. Peterson's been depositing the money in accounts across 3 different states, then transferring it offshore." Frank whistled low. The scope of the operation was staggering. "Here's the good news," Turner continued. "Peterson got greedy and sloppy. He's been using the same bank in the Cayman Islands for all his transfers. And thanks to some recent changes in international banking cooperation agreements, we can freeze those accounts if we move fast enough." McKenna stepped forward again. "The detective working this case, James Brennan, is solid, but he's got limited resources and a heavy caseload. We're going to help him build an airtight case against Peterson, and we're going to make sure every victim gets their money back." An older man in the back row raised his hand. "What exactly does that mean, Sam?" McKenna's smile was predatory. "It means we're going to document everything. Every transaction, every lie, every forged document. We're going to track down every victim and get them to file formal complaints. And then we're going to make sure Rick Peterson understands that when you steal from the motorcycle community, there are consequences." As the meeting broke up, Frank approached McKenna. Up close, the man's presence was even more intimidating. "Mr. McKenna, I wanted to thank you for organizing this." McKenna shook Frank's hand with a grip like a steel trap. "Frank Morrison, right? Heard you're ex-military. Army Vietnam, 68 to 70. Marines, same era. We look after our own, especially our veterans. Peterson made a big mistake when he decided to rip off people like us." McKenna handed Frank a sheet of paper with phone numbers and email addresses. "This is contact information for all the other victims we've identified so far. I want you to call each one, get their story, document their losses. Think of it as reconnaissance." Frank took the list. "What happens when we have all the information?" McKenna's pale eyes glittered. "Then we pay Mr. Peterson a visit and present him with an offer he'd be foolish to refuse." Over the next 10 days, Frank Morrison became an amateur detective. Armed with Samuel McKenna's list and a renewed sense of purpose, he spent hours on the phone tracking down Peterson's victims across 3 states. Each conversation revealed new layers of Rick Peterson's deception. The first call was to Marcus Webb, a retired firefighter from Phoenix who'd driven 6 hours to buy what he believed was a pristine 2018 street glide. Webb's story was eerily similar to Frank's. The same tale about a previous owner who only rode to church. The same temporary title paperwork. The same promises about processing delays. The worst part, Webb told Frank over a crackling phone connection, is that I sold my old bike to a neighbor's kid for half what it was worth. Figured I was upgrading, you know. Now I'm out 34 grand, and I'm back to driving my wife's minivan. The second victim, Patricia Chen, broke Frank's heart. She was a 58-year-old nurse from San Diego who'd saved for 3 years to buy her first Harley after her divorce. Peterson had sold her the same Electroglide for $27,000, spinning a story about needing to sell quickly to settle an estate. I should have known better, Patricia said, her voice thick with embarrassment. My ex-husband always handled the big purchases. I just wanted something that was mine, you know. By the end of the week, Frank had contacted 31 victims. The pattern was always the same. Peterson would target older riders, people who had cash available and weren't likely to be familiar with modern fraud techniques. He'd create urgency with stories about estate sales or owners moving overseas. Most devastating of all, he'd convinced many of them to sell their existing motorcycles to help fund the purchase. Frank compiled his findings into a detailed spreadsheet that would have impressed his old construction foreman. Names, contact information, purchase dates, amounts paid, and detailed notes about each victim's story. When he emailed the completed document to Samuel McKenna, his phone rang within minutes. Outstanding work, Frank. McKenna's gravelly voice came through the speaker. This is exactly what Detective Brennan needs to build a federal case. But we've got a problem. What kind of problem? Peterson's getting nervous. Our private investigator, Jack Turner, has been watching the dealership. Yesterday morning, Peterson loaded a moving truck with furniture from his office. Word on the street is he's planning to disappear within the next few days. Frank felt his blood pressure spike. Can't the police arrest him? Not yet. Brennan's still working with the district attorney to get the charges filed properly. These financial crime cases move slow, too much paperwork, too many jurisdictions involved. By the time they get an arrest warrant, Peterson could be sipping margaritas in Costa Rica. McKenna paused, and Frank could hear muffled voices in the background. We're having an emergency meeting tonight at the clubhouse. Can you make it to Riverside by 8? The Hells Angels clubhouse was a nondescript building in an industrial section of Riverside, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Frank had driven past it countless times over the years, but never imagined he'd be walking through the front gate. Inside, the main room was surprisingly clean and organized. Pool tables occupied one corner, a fully stocked bar dominated another wall, and motorcycle memorabilia covered every available surface. About 40 men and a handful of women filled folding chairs arranged in rough rows facing a makeshift podium. McKenna called for attention by simply raising his hand. The room fell silent immediately. Brothers and friends, we've got confirmation that Rick Peterson is preparing to run. Jack Turner has photos of him moving money and equipment out of the dealership. McKenna gestured to Turner, who stood and activated a laptop connected to a large television screen. These photos were taken this morning, Turner announced. The screen showed Rick Peterson loading boxes into a white van while talking on his cell phone. My sources at his bank indicate he's been liquidating accounts all week. We estimate he's already moved about $800,000 offshore. An older angel with arms covered in tattoos raised his hand. Sam, why don't we just grab this piece of garbage and have a conversation with him? McKenna shook his head firmly. Because that's exactly what he's expecting. Peterson knows he's ripped off bikers. He's probably got security cameras, maybe even hired protection. Any move we make against him directly will be recorded and used to paint us as the criminals. Frank found himself standing. So what's the plan? McKenna smiled, and Frank realized he'd just walked into the trap of being volunteered for something. The plan is that we're going to give Peterson a choice. Frank, you and 5 others are going to walk into that dealership tomorrow morning, dressed like regular customers, and present Peterson with a business proposition. What kind of proposition? Jack Turner clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed financial breakdown. Peterson has stolen approximately $1.8 million from motorcycle riders. Our forensic accountant estimates that about 1.2 million is still recoverable if we move quickly. We're going to offer Peterson a deal, return every penny he stole, plus interest, and we won't press for maximum criminal charges. And if he refuses? Asked Patricia Chen, who had driven up from San Diego for the meeting. McKenna's expression hardened. Then we make sure every motorcycle rider, mechanic, parts dealer, and motorcycle rally organizer from San Diego to Sacramento knows exactly who Rick Peterson is and what he's done. We make it impossible for him to operate in this community ever again. Turner brought up another slide, showing social media screenshots and forum posts. We've already started building the digital case file. Every major motorcycle forum, Facebook group, and Instagram page will have Peterson's photo and details about his scams. We're talking about reaching a community of over 500,000 riders across the Southwest. Frank studied the information being presented. It was sophisticated, thorough, and completely legal. You've done this before. The motorcycle community has always policed itself, McKenna replied. We just adapted our methods for the digital age. Over the next hour, McKenna outlined the strategy. 6 victims would visit Peterson Motors the following morning, ostensibly as a group interested in purchasing multiple motorcycles. They would record everything with hidden cameras provided by Turner's investigation firm. Once inside, they would present Peterson with a simple choice: voluntarily return the stolen money and cooperate with authorities, or face the combined wrath of the entire Southern California motorcycle community. What makes you think he'll cooperate? Marcus Webb asked. McKenna walked to the bar and returned with a thick manila folder. Because Rick Peterson isn't as smart as he thinks he is. Turner's investigation revealed that Peterson has a wife and 2 teenage kids living in a nice house in Upland. He coaches his son's Little League team and his daughter's soccer team. He's got a reputation in his community as a successful businessman and family man. Turner took over the explanation. Peterson's entire life is built on the image he's created. His neighbors, his kids' friends, his wife's family, none of them know he's a career criminal. When word gets out about what he's really been doing, his life as he knows it is over. Frank felt a mixture of admiration and unease. The plan was elegant and probably effective, but it also felt like wielding a nuclear weapon against a conventional threat. There's something else, McKenna continued. Our investigation uncovered evidence that Peterson has been operating similar scams for over 5 years. We found victims in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. The total amount of his fraud likely exceeds $3 million. The room erupted in angry murmurs. $3 million represented the life savings of dozens of people who'd worked hard and saved responsibly, only to be victimized by a predator who targeted their community. McKenna raised his hand for silence again. Tomorrow morning, we find out if Rick Peterson is smart enough to take the easy way out. If not, we show him why you don't steal from bikers. As the meeting broke up, Frank realized he was both excited and terrified about the confrontation ahead. After weeks of feeling helpless and victimized, he was finally going to face the man who'd stolen his retirement savings. But he also understood that tomorrow would determine whether this situation resolved quietly or escalated into something much larger and more dangerous. Patricia Chen approached him as he headed for the door. Frank, are you sure about this? What if Peterson calls the police on us? Frank thought about his empty garage, his depleted savings account, and all the other victims he'd spoken with over the past week. Patricia, I've been thinking about that all week. Rick Peterson is counting on us being too scared or too ashamed to fight back. Tomorrow, we will show him he picked the wrong community to mess with. At 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 6 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot of Peterson Motors. Frank Morrison adjusted the tiny camera clip to his shirt pocket, a device so small it looked like a decorative pin. Jack Turner had spent 2 hours the previous evening teaching them how to activate the recording equipment without being obvious. The team McKenna had assembled was strategic. Besides Frank, there was Patricia Chen, whose nursing background made her excellent at reading people under stress. Marcus Webb brought his firefighter's experience with crisis situations. Tommy Rodriguez, Frank's mechanic, had volunteered when he learned about the scam. His expertise would be crucial for technical questions. Angela Foster, a 52-year-old accountant from Palm Springs, could speak Peterson's language when it came to financial matters. Finally, there was Big Jim Kowalski, a soft-spoken giant who'd worked as a bouncer before retiring on disability. The mix was perfect. They looked like a legitimate group of riders with money to spend, not an organized confrontation force. Peterson's face lit up when the group walked through the showroom doors. Frank could practically see dollar signs in the man's eyes as he calculated the potential commissions from 6 simultaneous sales. "Welcome, welcome. I'm Rick Peterson, owner of this fine establishment. What brings such a distinguished group of riders to my showroom today?" Angela Foster stepped forward, playing her role perfectly. "We're part of a motorcycle touring club called the Desert Riders. We've got a major trip planned to Alaska next summer, and several of our members need to upgrade their bikes for the journey." Peterson's smile grew wider. "Alaska, now that's a serious ride. You'll definitely want something reliable with good wind protection and cargo capacity." He gestured toward the showroom floor. "Let me show you what I've got available." For the next 20 minutes, Peterson gave them the full sales presentation. He showed them touring bikes, explained financing options, and spun elaborate stories about the previous owners of various motorcycles. Frank noticed that Peterson was particularly focused on Angela and Patricia, probably assuming they would be easier targets. "Now, this beauty here," Peterson said, stopping in front of a gleaming road glide, "belonged to a retired airline pilot who kept it in a climate-controlled garage. Only for 200 miles, never seen rain or snow." Tommy Rodriguez caught Frank's eye. It was the same story Peterson had used on Frank's Electra Glide. "That's quite a coincidence," Tommy said casually. "My buddy Frank here bought a bike from you a few weeks ago with almost the exact same story. Retired airline pilot, garage kept, low miles." Peterson's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, Arizona seems to be full of retired pilots with motorcycle habits. Must be something about all that flying time making them want to stay closer to the ground." Angela moved to the next phase of their plan. "Before we get too far along, I need to ask about title transfers. We've heard horror stories about dealerships that can't provide clean titles quickly. Our insurance company requires proper documentation before we can add the bikes to our policies." "Absolutely no problem," Peterson replied smoothly. "I handle all my title work through certified agents. Clean paperwork, legitimate transfers, everything processed within 6 to 8 weeks maximum." Frank felt his jaw clench. The same lie, told with the same confidence. Marcus Webb stepped forward. 6 to 8 weeks? That seems excessive. Most dealers I've worked with can handle transfers in 2 to 3 weeks. Peterson's demeanor shifted slightly. He was still smiling, but his eyes had grown more calculating. "Well, it depends on the specific situation. Some bikes have more complex ownership histories than others." "Speaking of ownership histories," Patricia Chen said, pulling out her phone, "we've been doing some research on motorcycle theft rates in this area. Would you mind if we ran the VIN numbers through the stolen vehicle database before we make any commitments?" The change in Peterson was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and his hands began to fidget with the papers on his desk. That's really not necessary," he stammered. "All my inventory is legitimate. I've been in business for 15 years. Angela pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "Actually, our research shows this business has only been operating under the Peterson Motors name for 18 months. Before that, this location was home to Desert Wind Motorcycles, and before that, Golden State Bike Sales." Peterson's facade crumbled completely. He looked around the showroom as if searching for an escape route, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he said, his voice higher than before. "Maybe it would be better if you folks looked elsewhere for your motorcycles." Big Jim Kowalski spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of steel. "Rick, we need to have an honest conversation. We know about the scams, We know about the stolen bikes. We know about the fake paperwork and the offshore accounts. Peterson's legs seemed to give out, and he dropped into his desk chair. I don't know what you're talking about. Frank stepped forward. My name is Frank Morrison. You sold me a stolen Electra Glide 3 weeks ago for $29,500. You told me the same airline pilot story you just told us about that road glide. Peterson's eyes darted between the 6 faces surrounding him. Look, if there was some kind of mix-up with your paperwork, I'm sure we can work something out. There was no mix-up, Patricia said firmly. You sold me the same motorcycle for $27,000. Same bike, same story, same fake promises about title transfers. And me, added Marcus Webb, $34,000. Same bike, same lies. Peterson's face had gone from pale to grey. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Angela opened her tablet and began reading from a prepared statement. Richard Anthony Peterson, over the past 14 months, you have defrauded 43 victims in a motorcycle sales scam involving stolen vehicles and fabricated documentation. The total amount of theft exceeds $1.8 million. We represent an organization of your victims, Frank continued. We've documented every transaction, traced every bank transfer, and identified every forged document. We've also hired forensic accountants and private investigators to track your offshore accounts. Peterson's hands were shaking now. What do you want? Big Jim leaned forward slightly. We want to offer you a choice, Rick. A one-time opportunity to make this right before it gets much worse for you. Angela turned the tablet around so Peterson could see the screen. It displayed a detailed financial breakdown of his fraudulent activities. Our accountants estimate that approximately $1.2 million is still recoverable through your various accounts. We're offering you the chance to voluntarily return every penny you stole. In exchange, Patricia added, we'll recommend reduced charges when you surrender to law enforcement. Our group will support a plea agreement that focuses on restitution rather than maximum prison time. Peterson stared at the tablet screen, his breathing becoming more labored. And if I refuse? Tommy Rodriguez pulled out his own phone and showed Peterson a social media page. Then tomorrow morning, your photo and complete details about your scams go live on every motorcycle forum, Facebook group, and Instagram page from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. We're talking about reaching 500,000 riders. Your neighbors will know, Marcus added. Your kids' schools will know. Your wife's family will know. Everyone you coach Little League with will know exactly what kind of man you really are. Frank watched Peterson's face cycle through desperation, anger, and finally a kind of defeated acceptance. We also know about the house in Upland, the kids' college funds you've been building with stolen money, and the boat you bought last month. Everything you've built with our money disappears when this story goes public. Angela closed the tablet and set it on Peterson's desk. You have until 5 o'clock today to decide. Our attorney will be here at closing time with the paperwork for voluntary restitution. Sign it and you get to surrender on your own terms. Don't sign it and tomorrow you wake up as the most hated man in the Southern California motorcycle community. Peterson sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with unshed tears. How did you find out about my family? The same way you found out about ours, Frank replied quietly. You targeted older riders because you thought we'd be easy marks. You figured we wouldn't know how to fight back in the digital age. You were wrong. Big Jim stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across Peterson's desk. Rick, you've got 6 hours to do the right thing. I suggest you use them wisely. As the group prepared to leave, Peterson called out weakly, What guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word about the plea deal? Angela turned back to face him. The same guarantee our victims had when they trusted you with their life savings. None at all. But unlike you, we actually keep our promises. The 6 walked out of Peterson Motors in silence, leaving Rick Peterson alone with his desk full of forged documents and his rapidly closing options. Outside in the parking lot, Frank felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The confrontation had gone exactly as planned, but seeing Peterson's complete breakdown left him feeling oddly hollow. "Think he'll take the deal?" Patricia asked, as they prepared to leave. Frank looked back at the dealership, where Peterson was visible through the window, slumped over his desk with his head in his hands. He doesn't have a choice. His life as he knows it is already over. The only question now is whether he's smart enough to minimize the damage. At 4:47 p.m., that same Thursday, Frank Morrison sat in his pickup truck across the street from Peterson Motors, watching the dealership's front entrance through binoculars. Samuel McKenna sat in the passenger seat, speaking quietly into a radio headset. Around the block, other members of their group maintained surveillance positions, ensuring Peterson didn't attempt to flee before the deadline. "Any movement?" McKenna asked, lowering his radio. "Nothing for the past hour. His car's still in the lot, lights are on in the office, but I haven't seen him move from behind that desk." McKenna checked his watch. 13 minutes. Turner should be pulling up any moment now." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jack Turner's black sedan appeared at the end of the street. In the passenger seat sat attorney Rebecca Martinez, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crime restitution cases. Martinez had volunteered her services after learning about the scope of Peterson's operation. Apparently, her own brother had been scammed by a similar motorcycle fraud in Phoenix 2 years earlier. Frank's radio crackled. "This is Patricia. I've got visual on movement inside the dealership. Peterson's pacing behind his desk. Looks like he's on the phone. Probably calling his wife," McKenna muttered. "Or his lawyer. Or maybe trying to book a flight somewhere without extradition treaties." At exactly 5 p.m., Turner and Martinez walked through the front doors of Peterson Motors. Frank could see them through the large showroom windows, standing at Peterson's desk, while Martinez laid out several document folders. The conversation appeared to be brief and businesslike. 15 minutes later, they emerged. Turner gave a thumbs-up signal toward Frank's truck, then spoke into his radio. "Package delivered and signed." "Repeat, package delivered and signed." Frank felt a surge of relief so intense it made him dizzy. "He actually did it?" McKenna was already starting the truck's engine. "Looks that way. Let's go hear the details." They reconvened at the American Legion Hall, where nearly 60 people had gathered to hear the outcome. The crowd included all the identified victims, several Hells Angels members, and about 20 other motorcycle enthusiasts who'd heard about the confrontation through the community grapevine. Attorney Martinez stood at the front of the room with a manila folder thick with legal documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that Richard Peterson has signed a comprehensive restitution agreement. He's agreed to return every dollar he stole, plus interest calculated at 8% annually." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Frank found himself shaking hands with people he'd never met, all of them united by Peterson's crimes. Martinez raised her hand for attention. "Let me explain exactly what this means. Peterson has provided complete financial records showing the location of all stolen funds. Our forensic accountants will verify these records over the next 72 hours. Assuming everything checks out, full restitution will be distributed to victims within 30 days. Angela Foster, the accountant who'd been part of the confrontation team, stood up. "What about Peterson himself? What happens to him now?" "Peterson will surrender to federal authorities on Monday morning. He's agreed to plead guilty to wire fraud, interstate transportation of stolen property, and money laundering. Given his cooperation and the complete restitution, the recommended sentence is 4 to 6 years in federal prison." Marcus Webb raised his hand. "What about his business?" "The dealership." Jack Turner stepped forward to answer that question. "Peterson Motors will be permanently closed. The building is leased, so it'll revert to the landlord. Any legitimate inventory will be sold at auction, with proceeds going to cover administrative costs and any remaining victim compensation." Frank listened to the technical details, but his mind kept drifting to a simple, almost overwhelming realization. He was going to get his money back, all of it. For the first time in weeks, he could imagine walking into another dealership and legitimately purchasing a motorcycle without fear of being scammed again. Samuel McKenna took the floor. I want to say something to everyone here. What we accomplished today didn't happen because we threatened violence or broke any laws. It happened because we organized, we documented everything, and we presented our case professionally. This is how justice works in the real world. Big Jim Kowalski nodded in agreement. Peterson thought he could target us because we're bikers. He figured we'd either be too dumb to figure out his scam or too violent to pursue legal remedies. He was wrong on both counts. Over the next hour, Martinez distributed preliminary paperwork to each victim, explaining the restitution process and timeline. Frank learned that his $29,500 would become approximately $31,800 with interest. Not enough to completely make up for the emotional trauma, but sufficient to restore his financial position. Patricia Chen approached Frank as the meeting was winding down. I still can't believe it actually worked. When McKenna first outlined this plan, I thought it was too good to be true. The key was having someone like McKenna organizing it, Frank replied. Peterson might have ignored threats from individual victims, but he couldn't ignore a coordinated response from the entire motorcycle community. As if hearing his name, McKenna walked over to join their conversation. Frank, I wanted to thank you for the legwork you did tracking down the other victims. That documentation was crucial for convincing Peterson we had him completely boxed in. Frank shook McKenna's hand. I should be thanking you. Without your leadership, I'd probably still be sitting in my empty garage feeling sorry for myself. McKenna's expression grew serious. There's something else we need to discuss. Peterson's operation was bigger than just what happened here in California. Our investigation identified similar scams in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. We've got contact information for at least 30 more victims across those states. Frank felt a familiar surge of anger. How many people did this guy hurt? Conservative estimate? Over 100 victims, total theft probably exceeding $4 million. The good news is that Peterson's cooperation agreement requires him to provide information about all his criminal activities, not just the California cases. Attorney Martinez rejoined their group, overhearing the conversation. That's correct. Part of Peterson's plea deal involves full disclosure of his entire operation. Federal investigators will be working with law enforcement in multiple states to identify and compensate all victims. Frank was amazed by the scope of the investigation. How long will that take? Could be 6 months to a year for complete resolution, Martinez admitted. But the important thing is that Peterson's criminal enterprise is finished. He'll never be able to operate this kind of scam again. 3 weeks later, Frank stood in the showroom of Henderson, Nevada Harley-Davidson, the same dealership from which Peterson had originally stolen the Electra Glide. The manager, a professional woman named Carol Hughes, had called Frank personally to invite him to see their inventory. Mr. Morrison, given what you went through with that stolen bike, I wanted to make sure you had a positive experience this time around, Hughes said as they walked through the showroom. We've implemented additional security measures and enhanced our title verification processes specifically because of cases like yours. Frank stopped in front of a 2020 Electra Glide Ultra Limited, nearly identical to the bike Peterson had sold him. This one, however, came with proper documentation, legitimate provenance, and the backing of an authorized dealer with a 20-year reputation. What do you think? Hughes asked. Frank walked around the motorcycle, checking all the details he'd learned to examine during his weeks of investigation. The VIN was clearly visible and properly displayed. The title was clean and available for immediate transfer. The dealer's license was prominently displayed, along with certifications from Harley-Davidson Corporate. I think I'm ready to be a motorcycle owner again, Frank said. The purchase process took less than 2 hours. Frank paid with a cashier's check, representing his restitution money, plus the interest Peterson's crimes had earned. When Hughes handed him the keys and the legitimate title, Frank felt a sense of completion. he hadn't experienced since before Peterson had entered his life. On the ride back to Barstow, Frank stopped at a roadside diner in Victorville for coffee and to call Samuel McKenna with an update. McKenna answered on the first ring. "Frank, how'd it go at the dealership?" "Perfect. Clean title, legitimate transaction, and I'm back on two wheels. Outstanding. I've got some news of my own. The federal investigation just unsealed indictments against 3 other people in Peterson's network. Turns out he wasn't working alone. Frank was intrigued. What kind of network? Peterson was getting his stolen bikes from a theft ring operating out of Las Vegas. They'd steal high-end motorcycles from dealerships and parking lots, then sell them to Peterson for about 20 cents on the dollar. Peterson would clean them up cosmetically and sell them multiple times using fake paperwork. So there were other dealers involved? At least 2 more that we know of. One in Phoenix, one in Albuquerque. Same basic operation. Target older riders with cash, create urgency with fake stories, then disappear when the heat gets too high. Frank shook his head in amazement. How many people were getting ripped off by this thing? FBI estimates the entire network defrauded over 300 victims for a total loss of approximately $12 million. But here's the good news. Our documentation and methodology from the Peterson case is being used as a model for victim organizing in the other jurisdictions. What do you mean? McKenna's voice carried a note of pride. Motorcycle riders in Phoenix and Albuquerque are forming victim advocacy groups based on what we did here. They're using our playbook to pressure for full restitution and maximum prosecutions. Frank felt a surge of satisfaction. Their success in bringing down Peterson was rippling outward, helping other victims and potentially preventing future scams. There's something else, McKenna continued. The National Motorcycle Safety Foundation wants to interview you about your experience. They're putting together educational materials to help riders avoid fraud. Me? Why me specifically? Because you went from victim to advocate to investigator. Your story shows other riders that they don't have to accept being victimized. They can fight back, and they can win. After ending the call, Frank sat in the diner parking lot for a few minutes, reflecting on the events of the past 2 months. He'd started as an isolated victim, ashamed of being fooled and uncertain about his options for recourse. He was ending as part of a community that had not only recovered their losses, but had dismantled an entire criminal network. The motorcycle community's response to Peterson's crimes had proven something important. When honest people organize effectively, they can overcome criminals who rely on isolation and shame to protect their operations. Peterson had targeted bikers because he viewed them as easy marks. Instead, he'd awakened a network of advocates who would continue fighting fraud long after his case was closed. Frank started his new Electra Glide and pulled back onto the highway. In his rearview mirror, he could see storm clouds building over the mountains, but ahead the road was clear and the sun was shining. For the first time in months, Frank Morrison was exactly where he belonged, on the open road, riding a legitimately purchased motorcycle, with justice served and his faith in community restored. 6 months later, Rick Peterson was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The theft ring that supplied him with stolen motorcycles was dismantled, with 7 additional arrests across 4 states. The victim advocacy model developed by McKenna's group was adopted by law enforcement agencies nationwide as a template for organizing financial crime victims. Frank Morrison returned to his weekend rides through the desert, but now he also spent time speaking at motorcycle rallies about fraud prevention. Patricia Chen started a support group for scam victims. Marcus Webb became a volunteer investigator for the National Insurance Crime Bureau, and Samuel McKenna. He went back to running his Hells Angels chapter, but with a new reputation as someone who could organize justice when the system moved too slowly. Peterson Motors became a tire shop, and the motorcycle community made sure that everyone knew the building's history. The empty space in Frank's garage was filled again. But more importantly, the empty space in his sense of justice had been filled as well. Sometimes, when honest people refuse to accept being victimized, they can change the world, one criminal at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.